in the about intergroup contact in general and what we have found about the contact effects in terms of the mass immigration that we are experiencing in Turkey. So just out trying to outline what or how I organized this presentation. So I should also let you know that I have a lot of studies on refugees and I have a lot of studies on intergroup contact in general, but this is the first time I am trying to synthesize what I have specifically on intergroup contact and about the refugee group in Turkey. So, so this is how I thought about presenting this. So first, I'm going to start with the context. I think because I believe this really represents a kind of like a convenient setting to see what happens intergroup context in intergroup contact in such a context. And I will be talking briefly about the contact theory itself as well. So just trying to match the context and the theory itself. So then I am going to present some of the empirical studies we conducted in here with refugees. So just to let you know that I thought having this presentation of empirical studies in a non-chronological way is better in terms of the topic. So I will start with a little bit more kind of like trying to present a little bit what kind of like descriptive findings and the main associations we have with contact and attitudes in this context. So going overall in terms of the topic is going to get different over time. So so these studies they usually have mixed quantitative methods. So they will have a number of different samples. So both from children and adults. So usually from schools and versus to both university students and community samples, community sample with adults. And also at the end, I am going to try to link what we have found and some of the things that we can do further and discuss the theoretical and applied implications. So, as I said, I think the first thing to do is to describe a little bit the context. So, I don't know to what extent people have some ideas about the refugee context in Turkey. So, what happened is that after the civil war in Syria, Turkey has, I mean, I'm still confused with Turkey and Turkey, meanwhile, sorry. Turkey has received a lot of refugees, so over like 3.5 millions of refugees into the country. So this was an open door policy, basically. So this is why we call it a mass immigration context. So and I think Turkey now stands as one of the countries with the largest, population of refugees taken into the country. And at the same time, we have also experienced such a huge governmental investment as well. So whereby there have been a lot of policy investment in how to integrate refugees, how to accept refugees, and so on. Um, and what we have also observed is that at the beginning of this mass immigration, so I would say before it actually became a mass immigration context, at the beginning, people were fairly positive about receiving Syrians into the country. So because these were this is the Muslim brother group that we should help. So there were quite a lot of humanitarian concern, and then we should help our neighbors. And okay, let's open the doors, and then let's help this group of refugees into the country. So, and then what happened over the years is that this initially mild attitude has actually changed quite a lot into more like these are the neighbors who have overstayed in the country now. And then because of this fact that and also the government has started to also give new grants, such as like offering citizenship and so on. So basically, the idea or the initial mild attitudes have transformed into much more tension. So, and even to collective actions against refugees. To give you a couple of examples, so and you'll probably see in the slides as well. So we are mainly measuring attitudes through feeling thermometers. So ranging from 0 degrees to 100 degrees, with higher scores indicating more positive attitudes. And I think in some of our recent studies, so again, I'll show you examples, but just to give you like a headline here is that usually we find somewhere in between 20-25 kind of like degrees in feeling thermometers, which usually represent quite a low level of warmth and quite hostility in the case of refugees. And most of the time, so if you look at different ratings across different groups, so usually Syrian refugees as well as Afghan refugees. So I only also have one study with Afghan refugees here. So the attitudes are usually at the kind of like a similar level with usually like criminal and kind of like homeless groups and so on. Um, so and basically, if you look at this kind of like context, so scholars have been already measured quite a lot of different things related to symbolic and realistic threats, common in group identity, and what are the like main motivations behind this hostility and similar research. So, and today I'm going to focus only on the intergroup aspect because as an intergroup contact researcher, so we have always thought that, so in especially such kind of like conflictual or kind of like context where you have a lot of tension. So, intergroup contact can function as a very useful tool to create integration and harmony between the different groups. So, some kind of like general information about the intergroup contact theory. So this is now established as one of the most effective strategies to reduce conflicts and prejudice between groups. And we know that there are robust findings, even with meta-analytical and review findings. So in one review by Pettigrew and Troop, so we know that contact is related to reduced prejudice as a result of this meta-analytic findings with over 500 studies. And we also know that especially even if you have no kind of like facilitating kind of like factors that Alport initially suggested, and even in protracted conflict settings, and even if you have a lot of threat and discrimination in the situation. So empirical research shows that contact is actually one of the best strategies to reduce prejudice and ameliorate intergroup relationships in general. So, and this is how we kind of like started to build the link between the contact theory and the current context. So we are observing a very, very polarized kind of like context now. And also we can see that the attitudes are not getting better, but they are actually moving in the worst condition. So, and thereby we thought perhaps applying the contact theory in this context might be fruitful. And by doing that, we also wanted to focus on a number of different debates and research trajectories that could be observed within the intergroup contact theory within its own evolution. So, and recent debates about the potential societal effects at the macro level about intergroup contact. So they questioned things such as contact quantity versus quality. So which one is more effective? And this is a very relevant question for our case, because if you look at the pure numbers, so we know that with the mass immigration, so the chances that people would actually interact and meet with Syrian refugees increases, but at the same time, the attitudes are becoming much more hostile, which already shows a little bit of evidence that that it's maybe not about the quantity itself. But maybe it's just like the quality that matters for intergroup relations. And at the same time, so this whole not that novel now, but the recent debate about the potential for negative contact. So, and this has been suggested in 2010 by Paolini and colleagues. So, suggesting that, okay, so we are always talking about positive contact, imagining that this would be the natural case. But if we go, of course, to a number of different settings, so we can see that there is quite a lot of potential for negative contact too, and such negative contacts can be even more kind of like detrimental for attitudes and can can increase prejudice. So another question which was quite relevant for this research setting was also whether we can see macro level or societal changes beyond interpersonal relationships. I'm not so sure that I will be answering to this question because we don't have um, like data that is multi-level, but perhaps just like these kind of like different settings would give some idea at least. So, and a related question is the long-term dynamics, so long-term effects. So, whether contact strategies or contacts on its own is enough to create changes that are long-term. So, that could be kind of like transformative for societies. And finally, we also conducted some research studies with indirect contact strategies. So, indirect contact has been very popular within the last 2 decades, I think, after the initial, after these developments in contact theory, and suggest that perhaps we don't even need face-to-face direct contact, but we can also use, so in cases where you have potential for negative contact, or in cases where there could be some tension within the actual setting when you allow people to naturally interact with each other. So indirect contact can be can provide some effective ways whereby you can transform the attitudes. Okay, so and looking at recent intergroup contact literature, so positive contact, especially across different intergroup settings, including the native refugee relationships, has been found to be related to more positive attitudes and behavioral tendencies. So basically, tendencies that are related to willingness to contact, willingness to interact. So approach tendency. So basically, people's willingness to engage in closer relationships with the others. So it has been associated with reduced threat perception, so which is again one of the relevant things for us in here, because we know from the Syrian context in Turkey that some of the hostility, at least, is due to this kind of like both symbolic and realistic threat that people think Syrians pose for the country. And on the other hand, if we want to look at some of the mediating mechanisms, we know intergroup contact to improve attitudes by increasing empathy and perspective taking and reducing anxiety. And we also know that it also has some potential to not only changing like individuals or groups' attitudes towards refugees, but we also know that it has some implications for support for restrictive or non-restrictive migration policy. So basically, people's collective action tendencies, especially the solidarity-based one, would be dependent on the level of contact as well. Okay, so I would start with one study that we have recently conducted, but I think it is a little bit more descriptive. So, and this is one of the nationally funded project that we had. So, and a part of a larger study looking at conviviality and contact. So, conviviality is this term that, I mean, it is not that popular in the contact literature, but I think it's popular in the different fields. But this idea that so we have this belief that we can live together with another group because again this is quite important for the Syrian case because we know in especially in Istanbul, in various cities and so on. So people are actually living together. So they have different neighborhoods, but within the whole kind of like municipality. So you will see one street where you have a lot of Syrian shops with Arabic boards and everything, and people would actually speak Arabic as well. And then you also have the next street, which actually belongs to the Turkish local kind of like natives and so on. So, and we also wanted to look at these links. So this was a correlational study with a sample of like around like 1,000 people. And we collected the data through a research company from municipalities where we have quite density in terms of the Syrian population. And we also just like wanted to look at this overall idea that so perhaps contact, especially in those kind of like regions where we have quite a lot of diversity in terms of the refugee population. So would contact be a driver of social cohesion among the natives? So just giving the descriptive, so we have also asked people to report their subjective diversity, so willingness for contact and social distance and so on. So and all of these scores are on the extreme negatives, by the way. So I don't have the means and standard deviations in here, but if you look at the threshold, so we can see that people do not have this willingness for contact. So they report usually very high levels of social distance and low conviviality beliefs. So meaning that if we ask them whether they think they can actually live with Syrians, so the idea is not very optimistic. So they think they cannot live with this group quite well for a long period of time. But at the same time, what we wanted to look at was this link between contact and social cohesion, and we have found that the quality itself was very predictive of the social cohesion. So, and the social cohesion included not only trust to the outgroup, but the overall neighborhood social cohesion. So, to what extent people would actually help each other and then cooperate and so on. So contact quality was, as expected, related to increased social cohesion, but at the same time, so this is something that we expected a little bit as well. So looking at these like high levels of hostility is that with the numbers itself, so it might indeed go to the like more negative direction. So institutional contact quantity, for example. So by institutional, we asked about hospitals or kind of like schools and so on. Basically, that type of quantity, so their interactions within those settings were not associated with very positive outcomes, but it was related to actually greater social distance. So the more people, in fact, were interacting Syrian refugees at those institutions, so their belief that they can live with that group was actually more negative. So, and in fact, this also fits quite well with these more pessimistic diversity social cohesion studies by Putnam, for example, who says that, okay, if you increase the diversity, social cohesion is going to drop down and people would hunker down because they don't have trust and so on. And this was quite in line with that kind of like view of interactions with with the refugees. So then we have conducted another study. So this was a multi-study paper where we had different correlational studies. And the overall idea was to look at, again, the relationships between contact and behavioral tendencies. But this time we also suggested a further premise saying that, okay, so we can see that the problematic aspect is these behavioral tendencies, right? To what extent you want to approach and kind of like avoid the outgroup members. And we also know that usually those prejudicial attitudes, they lead to behavioral tendencies. But we also know that this is not always a straightforward link because attitudes may not be predictive of behaviors all the time. So there will be some factors that would suggest in some cases some boundary conditions whereby prejudice may not transform into avoidance tendencies and so on. And we suggested that contact might be one of these conditions. So if you have enough positive contact, enough positive interactions, you might still be prejudiced, but then that kind of like level of prejudice may not turn into the behavior itself. So, and this study was from a school. So all of these kind of like students and school-aged children data, they are from schools with, again, 15 to 20% percent Syrian refugees. So basically, they have quite a lot of contact with Syrian refugees. So here we measured as well specifically a form of contact that is particularly strong, and this was cross-group friendship quality. So for the kids, for the Turkish kids who have some Syrian peers they could consider as friends, so we suggested them for these kids, attitudes may not actually turn into more like avoidance behaviors. So on the one hand, we found this cross-group friendship quality to be predictive of greater approach tendencies, which is just like the usual link that has been found in the literature. But more interestingly, this is what we found, similar to all of these different studies that we had in the paper, is that so if you look at the association between prejudice and avoidance tendencies, so this is positive, right? But at the same time, we can see that those kids with higher cross-group friendship quality, so who have some friends at least, they could see as Syrian friends, they could see as kind of like someone they can trust and they can interact and they can spend time and so on. So for these kids, the association between prejudice and avoidance tendencies in terms of like the outcome measure was actually weaker. So, and this line was actually not significant. So the slope was not significant for the ones with higher levels of cross-group friendship quality. But for the ones who have lower levels of cross-group friendship quality, so lower levels of contact, so prejudice was actually quite strongly associated with avoidance tendencies. So the next research question that I want to go over is that, so this study show actually that perhaps, yes, there are links between contact and attitudes and so on. But at the same time, we also know from the contact literature this big question of whether one is causing the other one or whether there's a bidirectional relationship between contact and attitudes. And usually the literature shows that this association might be stronger for contact effects, but the reverse association whereby if you have positive attitudes, so you are more likely to have positive contact at the end. So this usually comes true as well. But we wanted to see how this would be again associated with approach and avoidance tendencies over time. So usually the literature has quite a lot of different longitudinal studies but usually not three-wave and usually not focusing too much on the behavioral tendencies. So, and here we also took into account the valence of the contact. So rather than focusing on cross-group friendship, so we said there would be two different types of contact. So one being positive, one being negative. And then we also focused on two different behavioral tendencies, one being approach a positive one, and the other is the avoidant one. And again, we collected data from early adolescence around like kind of like average age around 11. And we have the measurement over 15 months with three waves, and we used latent growth curve modeling. So, and what we were interested in was initially to find if there are kind of like relationship between intercept levels, so suggesting that these things are correlated. So also whether there are links between the intercepts and the slopes, so suggesting that one thing is more causal than the other one, but also looking at the associations between slopes, so which will show that the changes are actually associated. So, and what we found was that, so one thing perhaps again to note, and this has been something that we found in almost all the studies I'm reporting in here, is that the overall kind of like trajectories are quite negative. And this 15 months is kind of like referring to a school kind of like level year. So basically, for these kids, usually contact with Syrians is kind of like a novel experience. And for these kids, this is the first time they are contacting Syrians in a school setting. Because usually in the neighborhood settings, so the children would not interact too much. So it is more, there is more segregation at the neighborhood level. But in schools, it's kind of like mixed. So what we found was that this level of increase in both negative contact and avoidance tendencies over time, and also a significant decrease in positive contact and approach tendency. So demonstrating this overall increasing hostility. So, but what we were more interested in was to find out these associations between slopes, as I said. And what we found was that increases in positive contact, so they were associated with a less steep decline in approach. Okay, so meaning that approach is decreasing, but to some extent, positive contact, so increases the gains in positive contact, could buffer against this negativity. So, and also it is associated with a less steep increase in avoidance. So the ones who have more positive contact over time, so their avoidance tendencies is kind of like decreasing. So we also found negative contact to have this deteriorating effect over time, but again, positive contact itself, so the gains in positive contact over time could buffer against this increasing hostility in time. So another study where we looked at the dynamic change in terms of attitudes over time. So this is a recent paper that we have published as well. So this time we had another question because we know the links between intergroup contact and outgroup attitudes at different time points. And at the same time, recent research has suggested that one of the pathways or mechanisms whereby attitudes might change could be through the changes in the in-group. So how you feel about the in-group. So, and some of the early research papers, so they suggested this could be in-group identification, or Pettigrew suggested it was in-group reappraisal. So with intergroup contact, so people might actually change their views about their own group, and then this would be a mechanism leading to the change in the outgroup attitudes. So this is the traditional model. So basically, contact would be the initiating point, and then contact would be associated with how you view the in-group. And then at the end, you would have some changes in the out-group attitudes. And this is also called deprovincialization in recent research. So thereby, whereby you are going to see some changes and some openness to kind of like outgroups in general, which occurs through these lowered kind of like in-group identification. But other research has suggested an alternative pathway as well. One of them is how you could conceptualize the transfer effects from contact, because what could be suggested is that contact's primary transfer effect is really about the generalization to the whole outgroup, the specific outgroup. So, which means that the attitude change should occur actually before, and then you have the secondary transfer effect. So, this generalization includes openness towards the other groups. And we wanted to see, again, we had this three-wave longitudinal data, and then we wanted to see, so what kind of like pathway we should observe when it comes to attitude change and different forms of contact. So, and whether this is an immediate change in the in-group or out-group processes that occur before, or vice versa. So we measured positive and negative contact. So usually the items are like, to what extent do your interactions with the Syrians are positive, and to what extent it is positive or negative. So this is kind of like a quantitative measurement and self-reported idea of, so to what extent do you think this is positive or negative. So, and then we also had feeling thermometers for both the in-group and the out-group. So, and then what we found was that, so what happens in time one, so this is the traditional model, so where we suggest that both positive and negative contact would go first to the attitudes towards the in-group. So first there would be a change in how you evaluate your in-group, so you will feel less or more warm. And then this attitude change can also explain what happens towards the outgroup. But we didn't find any evidence for this model actually. So basically, positive contact and negative contact, they were not related to in-group attitudes at time one, at time two. But what we could observe was that there was a time one positive contact and time three out-group attitudes relationship, so which was positive. But when we tested the alternative model, so saying that first you have the contact at time one, so the primary function of this contact would be to change attitudes towards the outgroup. So in which case we find quite strong evidence in here. Time one positive contact was associated with time two attitudes towards the outgroup. So there is an immediate kind of change, I would say, in terms of the outgroup. So then this openness towards the outgroup at time two is also associated with lower levels of attitudes towards the in-group. So which means that the more you become open towards the outgroup as a result of positive contact. So at the end, so these attitudes towards the in-group, they are going to be weakened as well. So here I should also let you know that the levels of attitudes in here towards the in-group was quite high as well. So here we are not really talking about some kind of like general positivity towards the outgroup, but it was really over the thresholds of 90s, let's say, from the feeling thermometer as well. So it kind of like decreases this overly positive view of the in-group at the end. So, and then we have said, so these were most of the studies that we had about the correlational and longitudinal designs with the direct contact strategy. But as I said at the beginning, so the recent literature also talks about something called as indirect contact, so meaning that we don't actually need that type of direct contact. And especially if you think about a refugee context, so the natural tendency to interact with refugees, especially in a positive context, is very, very rare, to be honest. So I mean, the daily interactions are there, but this is really not the meaningful, actual positive contact that we want to see in order to see those improvements in the overall attitudes. So then we can resort to something called indirect contact strategy. So, and this was actually one of the first studies I conducted with Syria, so one of the oldest studies as well, 2017, about Syrian refugees. And we wanted to look at something called imagined contact. So, imagined contact suggests that you don't need to have a face-to-face contact. So what you can do is that you can, through a cognitive task, you can ask participants to imagine a positive contact scenario, and then you can follow it up with questions about attitudes and behaviors and so on. And you can see that the ones who are imagining a positive contact scenario, they actually end up with better attitudes. But we also wanted to kind of elaborate the traditional forms of imagined contact, where people say, okay, you're meeting this person from this outgroup, and then the interaction was positive and friendly and pleasant and so on. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to insert and add to the standard imagined contact scenario something about cross-group friendship potential. Because, as I said at the beginning, so this is one of the debates that has been suggested as well. So if the hostility is already high, so usual interaction scenarios may not work. So we need to strengthen it with one way or the other. So, and we said that, so this type of friendship potential might have some additional value here. And we conducted 3 different studies in different settings with different participants as well, so both adults and university students. With the adult study, we actually had this imagined scenario where they are thinking about a new Syrian neighbor that they meet on a random day, and then they think they can be friends. And we also had a number of different conditions where we wanted to elaborate the standard imagined contact scenario. So in study 1, we tested adding intimacy versus interaction. So 2 aspects of friendships that have been found to be important. So in study 2, we added both intimacy and interaction together. And in study 3, we added an explicit statement about the friendship potential. And this is the example from study 3, the experiment 3, where we added this direct friendship statement. So, and this is with university students. So imagine that, so the participants are reading this task, and then they are elaborating what they could have, have experienced in that scenario, after the scenario. Imagine that you are in the campus canteen, so it's a weekday and the canteen is full of people. So you buy your lunch, you sit at one of the tables, and a young Syrian student approaches you and asks whether they can sit next to you. You have a conversation for 15-20 minutes. So after the Syrian student leaves, you think how pleasant and interesting the conversation was. So until that point, this is one of the standard imagined contact scenarios. So what we have added is that your conversation went so well that you think you could be close friends with this person. So directly adding this open, explicit statement about friendship potential. And this is what we have found. So the first 2 experiments where we added interaction versus intimacy, so they have resulted in various differences as well, but not quite consistent. But if you look at experiment 3, so you can see that compared to the non-relevant and standard imagined context scenario. So this condition actually led quite a lot of significant changes. So improved attitudes and trust, so more positive viral intentions and reduced perceived perception of threat. So just to let you know that because this data were collected again in 2016 and 17, so these numbers here, they do not represent the worst case or the much hostility that we have seen within the last 10 years as well. So just to let you know. And also this is a university sample, so from quite a liberal private university, so may not represent, of course, the overall public opinion about Syrian refugees at this point. So another application that we have had, again, recently, and this paper was just like really like last month, it was published at BGSP. And what we did is again focusing on the school kids and early adolescents. So we wanted to create an alternative indirect contact scenario, because in previous research, so vicarious contact has been done. So vicarious contact is where students would actually listen to a story or they would watch a video and then they would see this positive interaction and they would have this vicarious kind of like formation of better attitudes. Uh, but uh, but we also found that these interventions were not that successful, especially in such a, again, hostile intergroup context. So what we said is that we could actually embed some of these different kind of like literatures into indirect contact strategy. And we ended up by having this novel intervention where we wanted to test reciprocal gifting. Okay, so and what we wanted to do is, so from a lot of anthropological research, we know reciprocal gifting is something good and something that regulates intergroup relationships, something that increases cooperation, harmony, liking, warmth, and so on. And so what we have done was to give these native Turkish kids some presents that are coming from their Syrian peers. And they were actually led to believe that they have received gifts, and then in return, they also kind of like prepare their own gifts. So representing to some extent an indirect form of contact between Turkish and Syrian children, because they don't see each other, but they are actually prepared receiving, and in return they are giving some gifts to those children. So, and we also had quite a strong design with a pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test with a control group. So in experiment one, it was 144 children. And with them, we had this kind of like initial reciprocal gifting procedure. So in experiment two, we had an enhanced version. So where this time children went much more creative in their own gifts. And we also measured both positive and negative attitudes as well as social distance. So the procedure was they had the pretest first, and then they were led to believe that they received small gifts from their Syrian peers. So this was accompanied with some voice recordings and so on from the so-called Syrian peers. So where in fact this was not the actual scenario. And in turn, they also prepared some gifts with the tools that are given by the researchers. So then they had immediately the first post test, and then 45 days later, so they had the delayed post test. So this is what we found for the first study, and the results of the second study is kind of like similar as well. So if you look at reciprocal gifting and the control group, so the reciprocal gifting group is represented by the blue bar, okay? So and the control group by the yellow bar. And then you have the three outcome measures of positive attitudes, negative attitudes, and social closeness. So, and what we found was that immediately, so as you can see from the graphs as well, so immediately after the procedure, we had some significant increases in positive attitudes. So, right after what happens in terms of this reciprocal gifting procedure, children actually had more positive attitudes, less negative attitudes, and greater social closeness. But as you can also see from the graphs that there was a kind of like already significant decrease in all of the positive outcomes. And you can see that at follow-up after 45 days have passed. So basically children's attitudes went back to normal and even worse. So this decrease, I would say, because in line with the previous studies, this decrease is kind of like consistent with a natural tendency. So this would have decreased anyway. But we can see that for the group with the reciprocal gifting, at least at some point, you can see that there's a time point whereby their attitudes are significantly better the ones in the control group, so who didn't do any kind of like who didn't engage in the any gifting procedure. So a further contact intervention that we had, I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. So this time, so and this study is actually with the Afghan refugees. So Afghan refugees, they actually came to Turkey quite later than Syrian refugees. So they are smaller in numbers, but at the same time, they're also usually uh, characterized by similar negative traits and even more negative ones because the timing of the immigration was right after the Syrian refugee one. So basically making this group as an additional kind of like threat and kind of like unwanted group. So, and if you look at, if you look at the contact literature, so one of the indirect strategies as well is to use mass media. So basically, you can communicate positive or negative contact, or you can communicate negative or positive portrayals of different groups through the use of media or social media in general. And and this is again quite relevant for Turkey as well, and especially in places where we don't really have direct interactions with refugees, is that so for many people, the only information they have about refugees is not coming from their own natural contact, direct contact, but it's coming from what they know, what they observe in media. And there is also quite a lot of research conducted about the negative and dehumanizing portrayals of refugees. So suggesting and using using these quite dehumanizing words. So and they are they have been part of this rhetoric whereby people were talking about the flood of refugees and so on. So, and there have been quite a lot of protests in social media as well against refugees. So, hashtag we don't want refugees kind of things. So, and this was quite popular in social media for a while. So, and thereby we thought that if we succeed in changing those portrayals and using mass media in order to communicate different representations of attitudes, so maybe we can change attitudes in a positive way too. So, and we wanted to look at here also at dehumanization, because we know a lot of refugees have been portrayed in with these dehumanizing attitudes and behaviors on media, and especially, for example, if you look at this photograph, so you can see that most of the time people were primed with those photographs, whereby you are having kind of like a lot of people as if they are invading a place or a country and so on. So, and people have been already primed with those kind of like pictures and photographs in the in media tools. So we had two studies, the first one being correlational and the second being experimental. And what we found was that positive mass-mediated contact. So we measured this with items such as to what extent are you exposed to positive kind of like things or positive events about refugees, or to what extent it is negative. So what you hear in media, to what extent it's negative. And as we can see, both seem to play a role in the prediction of dehumanization. So basically, positive contact is associated with lower dehumanization, and negative contact has a positive association. And in turn, as we could expect, so dehumanization is related to lower positive attitudes and also lower support for for the refugee rights. So then we had an experimental procedure where we gave people some bogus news reports, kind of like exemplifying something either positive or negative about Afghan refugees. So in the positive one, we depicted someone as Najib K. As an Afghan refugee, so who has been one of the people who won a critical prize in chemistry and so on. So illustrating a positive scenario about Afghan refugees. In the negative condition, we had the reverse. So we said that that the cultural and the scientific developments in the country have impeded with increasing Afghan immigration into the country. And this is what we found in study 2. So this is the main effects of the condition. So this time we found negative mass-mediated contact to be quite effective in terms of increasing dehumanization, decreasing positive attitudes, and also decreasing support for rights. So again, these attitudes, 16 points is out of 100. So basically suggesting that, so this is the feeling thermometer, and it's very much on the extreme negative side of the scale. And if we look at the mediation model as well, so this time negative contact only, not the positive one, negative mass-mediated contact increased dehumanization, and in turn, it was associated with lower positive attitudes and lower support for rights. Okay, so to wrap up, some of the theoretical implications. So what we found from these studies is that especially there is quite a lot of difference in terms of how we should see contact in this context. So this has been one of the topics, one of the main topics in the overall contact literature. But I think in some cases, this differentiation might matter more, especially when you have mass people from that group. So, and we know quality over quantity matters more. And we also know that, so what we mean by actual contact is usually not those very small, brief interactions that people have on the street. On the other hand, we also know that if you look at the type of contact, positive contact seems to be a little bit more effective than the negative one, except the mass-mediated one. And this is a finding that we have also found, that we also detected in some other conflictual intergroup contexts. The literature on positive negative contact initially suggested that negative contact might matter more because it generalizes easily to attitudes. But recent research usually has mixed findings. I think in our case, the fact that positive contact is a little bit perhaps more transformative is because this is the salient experience for people. So, because contact is so rare, and even if you have it, it's usually negative. So then positive contact is more likely to be remembered and generalized more to the attitudes. So we also found that the location or where it happens matters as well. So whether this is public in the park or whether this is in the hospital, whether this is in school and so on. And also like these kind of like whether this is occurring naturally or a structured form is actually better is quite questionable still. And also, as you can see in some of the studies as well, that contact might be transformative in the sense that it doesn't make attitudes or it doesn't lead attitudes to be on the extreme positive side. But what it does is that because hostility is too high and the prejudice is already very high, so basically it can just buffer as it can just function as a buffer against the increasing hostility over time. So especially when the intervention is short term, as we have done. In terms of the applied implications, so if you look at the literature, so we have had some longitudinal studies and brief interventions, but we don't have much applied studies conducting these interventions long term. So basically, we know longitudinal findings, but contact interventions have been uh, only like applied in rare occasions. And usually one of the reasons for that is that so attempts for school-based programs are often not successful. So not approved very easily. It is very, very difficult to work in applied settings with Syrians. We need to ask for quite rigid kind of like policies and agreements and so on. And most of the time, so something that also accompanies this is that there is quite a lot of increased resistance from the parents, especially if you go to school children, for example, and if you ask parents that you are going to apply something based on contact with serial children, so many of them are going to refuse it. The schools and teachers. So I think at some point because we have had quite a lot of workshops with teachers as well. So we gave quite a lot of different workshops and seminars for teachers and schools. And usually they do have quite a lot of low efficacy beliefs. So they are here, so they know things are problematic, but they don't have the actual tools to about like I mean, they don't take responsibility most of the time in terms of engaging in fruitful interaction programs. And usually the quality of any types of interventions or tasks, they are not assessed. What could be done next, or how could this literature or applied studies they could be developed is that, I mean, there are still new studies. So the good news is that the TÜBİTAK, the national funding agency in Turkey, so they are still willing to fund projects on Syrians and so on kind of like intergroup relations between natives and Syrians at least. And this has been easier now to conduct studies, especially the applied ones. So one of the most recent ones that I have seen is that focusing on contact between Turkish and Syrian women's cooperative work. So they are doing these knitting workshops and so on. Uh, it is important to also, I think, elaborate on what could be added further to the contact strategy. So most of the time what we have seen, it's just a buffer, or it kind of like eases things a little bit to some extent, but then if this is not sustainable, it fades away very quickly. So which means that one way is to have more sustainable interventions, of course, continuous interventions, but at the same time, so it is also possible to embed other different, like other strategies that could improve the attitudes, such as perspective taking or kind of like common group identity strategies. Uh, so basically, there is also quite a high level of residential segregation. So, and particularly the language barrier is still quite a big problem. Uh, One thing also to note is that the effects of contact among the refugees is really, really not understood well, because in the literature we know for minority groups contact is less effective than majority groups. But in Turkey, we don't know how it would relate. So again, because it is very difficult to work with refugees in the country, and it has been difficult at least for a while. We don't know very much about how it affects or how it links with the acculturation preferences, attitudes in general. So well-being, there is some, but it doesn't show something that could be applied, especially to the contact setting. So we know also that there are other things to also to look at some of the things that play a critical role in hostility, such as reducing these threats about realistic or symbolic resources. And also, so one way to go further, again, of course, is to engage in educational activities. And these topics are rarely studied, and at least they're embedded in educational curriculum in schools. So, and in the future, hopefully, there will be much more work on this. So, thank you very much for listening. I don't know whether I used my time efficiently.